Welcome back to the Strauss Center's Informational Space Policy video series. My name is Alyssa Goessler, and I'm a graduate research assistant at the Strauss Center's Space Policy program. Today, I am thrilled to host Luc Riesbeck for the next video in our expert interview series. Luc Riesbeck is a space policy and research analyst at Astroscale US, where he engages in collaboration across the space community to find comprehensive solutions to orbital sustainability challenges. He is a recent graduate of the Space Policy Institute Master's Program at George Washington University. His research interests include space sustainability, orbital debris mitigation, and ethics in science and technology. Riesbeck also holds a bachelor's degree in social sciences and a minor in global China studies from New York University, Shanghai. In 2018, he was selected as a fellow in the Brooke Owens Fellowship's second annual class. Luc, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have a lot of really exciting questions, and I'm really eager to get this conversation going. But before we jump into the nitty-gritty policy questions, could you tell us a bit more about your own academic path and career, and specifically focus on, like what drew you to the field of space policy and why did you end up choosing a position in the private sector? And I'd also love it if you could tell us a little bit about your time at Astroscale, what you do there, what your average day in the office, or I suppose in the home, but eventually the office has looked like for you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks again so much for having me. I'm really excited to be featured in the series. It's nice, very nice of you all to invite me. Yeah, so I actually didn't think that I would go into space at all when I started off my undergraduate career. I decided to go to NYU Shanghai. It was a very new program at the time. There was only 1 year above ours there. And so it seemed like a bit of an adventure and something I wanted to pursue. But space did not even cross my mind. I went in for a social science degree. And I knew I wanted to do something in the realm of technology and sort of international relations. So I assumed there would be something at like a UN or some kind of diplomatic thing, maybe Department of State or Foreign Service, something in those lines that I would eventually pursue. But I was lucky enough to, catch wind of a NASA internship that was being posted for the headquarters office. There's an office there that is the Office of International and Interagency Relations. And they're the hub for NASA's outreach with other international space agencies and, the interagency of within the US government. So I thought, hey, okay, there's a cool intersection of science and technology and diplomacy and, that kind of stuff. So I applied for that and I ended up getting it. And that was really a foundational experience for me in terms of introducing me to how governments use space policy as just sort of another tool in their toolbox of foreign relations and diplomacy, but also the huge range of applications for space technology. So I would say that internship itself was pretty foundational for me. That's what really sort of set the course for me to pursue space policy. So yeah, I think from there, I was lucky enough, my supervisor there introduced me to the Brooke Owens Fellowship that was also sort of early on in its early stages. And he suggested that I apply for that. I had no idea what to expect going in because at my undergraduate institution, there wasn't really a specific space angle. I mean, we didn't even have a aerospace engineering program there. There was, I think, one class about how space was used as a, sort of diplomatic tool during the Cold War. But
more
other
than
most
universities have.
Yeah, I think I was in the history department. So yeah, I mean, a little bit, but definitely not the expertise that I was really, hoping to cultivate. So, so through that fellowship, I was placed with a couple of different mentors. And I also had the chance to do a summer internship that following summer at a company called Space Capital in New York City, which is a venture capital company. And they invest in commercial space companies. And that is what really sort of opened my eyes to, hey, there are things other than NASA level going on in the space world. So I learned a lot about commercial space. I learned a lot more about the history of the commercial space sector in the US in particular. And I would say that experience is what, helped propel me towards the private sector. So yeah, I ended up following undergrad. I went ahead onto a master's program at GW within their Science and Technology Policy Institute. They have a Space Policy Institute within that. And so that's how I was introduced to Astroscale and the great work they're doing there. So.
Awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's, I know for me personally, that's heartening. I didn't pick up space policy until a little bit later in my studies. And I know a lot of students at the beginning of their career have this sense of, oh, there's one right way to do a career in space policy. And I think, your story is a great example that there is no one way. There's a lot of different ways to approach it. And it's a little unpredictable, maybe.
Absolutely. And in fact, I mean, space policy is one of those fields where you actually need different kind of skill sets. You need different expertise. You need folks who have maybe, hardcore budgets and finance backgrounds. You need the technical expertise, engineers and, scientists who want to come over and help shape policy. And then you need sort of the pure international relations policy folks who help with some of the diplomatic side of things. So yeah, so at Astroscale, I joined. I was a graduate intern there, and then I joined full time after I graduated into the pandemic this past summer. So just over a year ago now, and so
wow,
yeah,
what a time to graduate.
I know a lot of other students are in that position now, thinking about, what am I going to do? Should I take a gap year? Should I go straight to grad school? That kind of thing. So I feel very lucky to have found a team at Astroscale US that I really wanted to continue working with following my studies. So yeah, so I act as a research analyst there. And our day-to-day, I guess I would describe it as a little bit of everything. We have sort of the background core research that we're always sort of doing every now and again underneath everything on issues relevant to space sustainability and orbital debris mitigation. But then we also have sort of a consulting technical element as well, where we're working closely with our technical team to develop, the capabilities from a technical perspective and from a business development perspective as well, the business cases for services like, life extension in geo, active debris removal, which is those giant massive stages and things like that. And then other services like end of life, which is prepared deorbit for things like the Leo constellations, things like that. So there's a lot of different regulatory and policy and legal questions that are inherent in those activities, particularly when they're done by commercial companies, because this is a market that we're still seeing, first movers in, and we're still seeing it unfold. So it's one of those hard problems, space debris and space sustainability. So you never have the same day twice. It's a little bit of everything when you're trying to work on those problems.
Well,
Yeah.
it sounds very dynamic, and also it sounds like they keep you quite busy over there, but it appears you enjoy it. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely what I like. I'd rather work on issues that are harder than the issues that are easy.
Yeah, well, you've certainly picked the right problem to take on then, orbital debris, my goodness. Well, so my next question kind of builds off of something you were mentioning earlier, and when you were talking about how you need folks with all different types of expertise addressing these issues. So you had also spoken about this in a recent interview with Space Talent when you said that taking a wide range of electives during your undergraduate studies has positively impacted your career. Could you tell us more about this? Like, why is that important? And then if maybe provide, if you have one, an example of a specific course from a discipline that might not seem like it's related to space, but paid dividends in your career or research.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I have said this before. I mean, uh, NYU is great about giving their students a pretty wide open range of options for their electives, even for tracks that are, very rigid and technical. And I think that was very, very formative for me. The reason I say that is because in a field like space, even though there's a lot of different things you can work on within that, each of those individual technical challenges is so easy to get siloed into.
Yeah.
It's like much of the rest of the tech industry in that way, where you can kind of put your blinders on and try to just solve one problem, and just given the history of the space sector in particular, there are very sometimes rigid bounds around the approaches you take to solve problems in space. And so, now I think more than ever, there's kind of been shifts and changes in those approaches. We're seeing the space sector, particularly in commercial space, be disrupted, for lack of a better term, in the same way that internet technology companies were doing this a little while back. And so with that, you need to bring the perspective and the knowledge of other disciplines that ensure that you're approaching these problems in a holistic way. Otherwise, you're not really going to have a full comprehensive and robust solution, and you're probably going to miss things that will come back to bite you later. So I try to keep that relatively vague, but
Yeah.
there's definitely a benefit to staying curious and to indulging that curiosity that you have for other disciplines, even when you're working on technical problems that seem to have very sort of firm boundaries around them. So yeah, I think an example of a class that I took.
If one comes to mind, if not,
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that some of the history classes that I took, even just for the work that I do, courses that taught me better ways of finding sort of underrepresented or underwritten about perspectives on historical events have been really helpful for me when trying to research answers or potential solutions to policy problems that are specific to space. So, for example, I took a course when I was in my undergrad on the history of the, for lack of a better term, the Silk Road, about the economic impact of, that beltway and over the course of Chinese history, how incredibly influential it was to the communities around it and to the development of the country. And there were a lot of, I guess, myths or just things that I had been taught in the past or read about in the past that once we started as a class together to dig into those sources, we realized were very much written by the winners of history and not really representative of what happened, right?
Yeah.
And that is very, very useful, not just when thinking about history, but thinking about how we do science, who gets to do it, and you know, who is impacted by it, are two completely different communities a lot of the time. And so when you're looking at forming science and technology policy and suggesting what should be priorities for a nation, for a specific agency, for a specific team, those are things that, you know, having those cross-disciplinary or, you know, outside of your strict discipline tools, it really helps you ensure that you're getting a more, you know, holistic view. So, yeah.
That's a really great example. And I like it because I feel like the impact of this cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, whatever approach is sort of twofold. Like it seems like there's an information piece. So sometimes there's like an actual bit of information from another discipline that brings wisdom to bear. But a lot of it seems like it's a methodology. So like a thinking differently or a questioning of assumptions, which is something we see a lot in maybe, you know, newer history courses. And so bringing that method into the space policy discipline, that's a really great way of putting it. So thank you for that.
Definitely. Yeah, there are, especially now, I mean, even outside of the commercial space, there are a lot of countries who are only recently getting involved in space activities, and being able to have a wider ranging consideration of, you know, what people are focusing on, what people are specializing in those newer space programs for these emerging space nations. That's really, it's really a prime opportunity to say, hey, you know, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can specialize in what you want to do. And you can bring in other disciplines to be a little bit more creative.
Yeah, that's a wonderful insight, and something I think we'll circle back to a little later when discussing one of the reports you recently co-authored. So we'll put a pin in that briefly. And before getting to that, so you also previously discussed how the space industry was not designed for everyone to succeed. This design means that folks from marginalized communities may think that they're experiencing an imposter syndrome, when in fact what they are feeling is, quote, likely a logical recognition and reaction to the biases and marginalization that are still prevalent across space organizations. So this is, I just think, a really important insight, and I was hoping you could tell us a little more about this faux imposter syndrome, and maybe if you have it, lend some advice to folks who are either A, feeling the weight of these biases, or B, people in space organizations who want to undermine this legacy of marginalization. Yeah,
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's definitely an important point. Yeah, I think it depends on whether you're talking about sort of legacy space or newer space or something in between. But regardless, there has definitely been an opening up of space academia, government, commercial, you know, programs. But with that said, I think with that opening up, there are often, especially, you know, this sort of oncoming generation of researchers and engineers and analysts, they are experiencing situations where they may be the only person of their particular background present in a team, or in a meeting or in a classroom. I think several of my colleagues in the Brooke Owens Fellowship, for example, they've talked at length about how particularly those who are in engineering, even still, they are often maybe the only woman in their classroom or in their program. And you know, it's a very positive thing to see people forging new ground. But I think it's unreasonable for students to be expected to take that on without an understanding that it's likely going to impact them. It's likely going to weigh on them a little bit, and that is to be completely expected. There are definitely a lack of resources, I think, particularly for students in this particular area. Students have self-organized extremely well across particular academic institutions to provide support to each other. And there are starting to be a couple more of these programs and whether that's scholarships and fellowship opportunities or, book clubs and cohorts of like-minded individuals getting together to try to form a little bit more community and engage with each other, but it is still extremely isolating. So when you are somebody from a marginalized background, and again, underrepresented means you have been excluded. It is not accidental, it is intentional, right? As we start to see more of people from those excluded backgrounds enter the space field and join teams, there's a lot of stigma and mental pressure associated with that. People sometimes think they have to sort of carry the torch or be a spokesperson or a representative for entire communities. And while some people may be comfortable with that and they may love doing that and take it as a source of pride, I have seen a lot of, a lot of those types of people become, in consequence to that, extremely perfectionist and self-critical and carrying that burden and expecting themselves to just be pushed to be 10 times better than their peers simply to prove that they are worthy of being included in the space industry or in academia. And so when I see people, especially people from these marginalized communities who are doing great and really being incredible role models and helping each other and volunteering and just generally even with this extra added pressure and added lack of accommodations, still excelling, and then they turn around and say, well, I don't really feel like I'm good enough, or that's where I start to say, okay, so there's a difference between that imposter syndrome and the imposter syndrome that may be felt by somebody else, right? If that is an accurate description of you and you feel like you have imposter syndrome, that is probably actually you saying, hey, I seem to be doing great, and yet I am still being treated poorly in this environment. That is not imposter syndrome. That is just the environment is not supporting you. And you are not getting the appreciation, accommodations, scholarships, TA positions, awards, etc., that you have earned and that you deserve. So that is something that I think I tried to speak out a little bit about, because it doesn't actually serve you to be overly self-critical. It only serves you to be self-critical when that self-criticism aligns with the reality of your performance. And it's helpful, it's motivating and positive for you, and it helps you achieve the goals that you want to achieve. Beyond that, it becomes detrimental. And I see, especially women and gender minorities, especially people of color, just do this a lot, and they take on that extra self-criticism that is actually, they don't interpret it as being caused by the actual environments. They think it's oh, it must be me, I must be the problem. So that's what I'm trying to discourage. And a great way to do that, a great way to get out of that mental habit and mental loop is to find other peers and other mentors that can give you very honest feedback about how you are doing. And they can ensure that that perception that you have of your own ability, if you're being really down on yourself about something, they can ensure that, you know, that critique is matched and met with a level of critique that is, you know, more aligned with what you're actually putting out there. So you're not quite as self-critical, and you don't need to be. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And I really appreciate you highlighting that continually and you know, putting, because that's work when you do that, and that's energy. But I do think that's a big step in, you know, letting people know, you know, no, you're not alone. And this isn't in your head. It's a,
Yeah,
as you put it, like a reasonable reaction to some very odd cognitive dissonance. So
completely.
yeah, I really appreciate that. And it's just like a super important conversation to have, and to let people know, like, reaching out for a network and for support is an extremely reasonable thing to do, and a really healthy first step.
Yeah. I think, you know, also, you know, you mentioned what can folks do within an organization. That's a little bit tougher. It's definitely highly dependent on what you have. If you have existing resources like a student union or a graduate students union, for example, if you're still a student in academia, like that would be the first place I would point people. But, you know, when you're already outside of school and you're just working in the industry, I think particularly after, you know, we're a year out from 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of internal groups were started at companies. And, you know, there's some of these organizations, particularly in the commercial space industry, have done a great job of kind of putting their money where their mouth is and trying to affect change within their institutions. But as a whole, I mean, there hasn't been a ton of, you know, radical change, I don't think. And so it's easy to get frustrated by that. And it's completely valid to be frustrated by it. So if you are within an organization that you think hasn't really done a lot in terms of trying to, you know, diversify and, you know, actually materially support and include marginalized people and marginalized perspectives in your work, you know, if you are an employee, you can tell your management that that matters to you, and you can advocate for that within your institution.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And it's like definitely on all of us to leverage that momentum and not get comfortable just because, you know, we're post-pandemic and things, for those of us who maybe have more distance from some of these problems, we're not feeling the impact as much necessarily. But that doesn't mean we gotta just sit back and, you know, take it easy. It's important to, yeah, to step up when things are less obvious necessarily.
Yeah, I think it often really does start at the interpersonal level.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if there's a you know, something that happens within your team or within your wider department, and you notice it, not just letting it slide and you know, kind of being a bystander. It's a bit of a cliche, but it actually does it does materially make a difference when people say, "Hey, this matters to me." You know, we don't have a inclusive you know, family leave plan, for example,
Mm-hmm.
like maternity and paternity leave plan.
Yeah.
You know, we're noticing that there are discrepancies in X. Like those are small things that, you know, you can join with your colleagues and say, hey, this does matter. And often sometimes starting that conversation with management is all it can take to just get a trajectory started. So yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that. And I mean, as a
Yeah.
young professional, just starting to eventually, you know, I hope to be in an organization, time will tell after I graduate. But it's really helpful to start my career with these things in mind and go into a new position thinking about how can I help affect positive change in this environment and make sure that my morals and ethics align with the space that I'm going to be spending so much of my time in, because I think it's
Yeah.
really important. So thank you.
Yeah.
I hate to end this topic, but we have also so many really important space issues to get to. So
Let's keep it going.
yeah, we're going to take a quick pivot over to the legacy of the Cold War. So
Okay.
in a recent study that you co-authored, you and your colleagues explain how developing space nations face new and unique challenges associated with a more congested, competitive, and contested space environment. You contextualize this central argument within the broader historical landscape of competition in space, highlighting how the legacy of the Cold War is still felt today. Could you tell us a little bit more about this research and maybe highlight some of its implications for policymakers, both in emerging space nations and in more established space nations? I think it was a really great report. I loved the part on the UAE in particular. I focus on the UAE space policy, and
oh, that's right. Yeah.
there's just not a lot of writing, and somehow I hadn't found this case study before. So you and your colleagues will be cited in my thesis.
Oh, that's so, wow, what an honor.
Well, I mean, it's a really great work, and I would selfishly love if you could tell us more, and hopefully the audience enjoys it too. I'm sure they will.
Well, thank you for the plug. That's a robust and resounding endorsement of our research. I'm very honored. Yeah, this project was done as the sort of master's thesis for this Space Policy Institute program. Okay. So I was joined by a couple of colleagues, within that program that I had been working with over the past 2 years. They are fantastic co-authors, Ashley Peter, Renata Komal, and Mackenzie Pujhal. And all four of us had the opportunity basically to say, okay, we know what's important to us. We know that we are seeing what seems to be an exponential rise in new space agencies over the past couple of years. What's really behind this? What is the what's the motivation if you are a country that doesn't have a space program to start one now, in 2015 or 2017 or 2020, rather than starting one back in the 80s or 90s, or what's changed essentially. So we went through all of the countries that had formulated these new national space agencies akin to a NASA or a DLR or a Roscosmos within their individual nations. We also looked up a couple of different regional organizations that have been founded akin to an ESA, several countries getting together within a region and collaborating together on space programs. But there was a couple of different things that we did for this research. The UAE stuff in particular, my colleagues, Ashley and Mackenzie, had a trip planned to go visit the UAE and tour their facilities and interview some of them, some of the UAE Space Agency's members. And this was in March of 2020.
Oh, I think something happened in March 2020.
So that trip didn't quite happen. But regardless, my colleague Renata and I were able to go to Luxembourg and conduct a case study there. So they were our second kind of major case study, UAE and Luxembourg. And we thought that these two new space agencies really kind of exemplified, the ideals of what these newer space agencies were all about. Mm-hmm. The biggest, I think, takeaway that we had was, these newer space nations were not interested in, doing exactly what NASA does. They were not interested in things like, human launch, for example. They were not interested in establishing necessarily, their own, space stations or anything like that. It was much more how can we encourage commercial space activity within our own economy? What do we need to lay in place in terms of the policy, the legal, and regulatory foundations, the economic incentives and stimuluses needed for that? How can we make our country an attractive place for commercial space to come and do business within that country? And that is very interesting because even towards the end of the 90s, a lot of the focus was still very much the services provided by space systems, things like ISR and comms and surveillance, EO, agricultural data and things like that. There was not a specific focus on just let's open it up to commercial space. And so so I think in general, some of the core, I guess, lessons learned for the more established space nations, the ones who are already have been doing this for a while, is that these newer space agencies and within these nations are 100% ready and willing to fill your capability gaps and your technology gaps in exchange for things like exchanges of data and advice and guidance on the policy and regulatory side. I think for one of the other sort of core pieces of advice that we had for established space nations was take a step back and look at their approach, because these new space nations are really moving very quickly because, like I said, they are able to specialize and they're able to pick what is going to be of most direct benefit to them, and all of the groundwork is already done, so they can get right into using commercial launch, for example, for small satellites, the university research hubs, things like that within their countries. So there has been, up till now, I guess, we observed kind of a teacher-student dynamic with these legacy space nations and these emerging space nations, but we're trying to encourage those organizations to say, hey, you also could potentially have a lot to learn from them in how you conduct your missions. For the the newer space nations, I think the core piece of advice that we provided to them was just take the time to actually study and get a core sort of rationale and principle for what you want your agency to accomplish before you started. Because when you consider what your nation's existing capabilities are, you can often find now commercial off-the-shelf services and systems that can fulfill a lot of those goals that you have. So if you can by all means create an agency, but if you don't need to necessarily create something in-house, you don't have to do that anymore. A lot of this is just available for purchase on the market. So so specializing and taking advantage of the lack of tons of bureaucracy that some of these legacy space nations have to decide on where you want to move sort of quickly and cheaply.
It's such exciting research and really, really just relevant across. I could ask you so many follow-up questions. I will restrict it to one. I'm curious if you had any thoughts or, in reviewing the policies and work of these emerging space nations, do you think that this focus more on, how do space assets fit into our commercial endeavors? What do you think might be the repercussions of that for a nation's approach to sustainability in space? Because I could kind of imagine it going either way. Like, one, they might see the writing on the wall with orbital debris and space traffic management and say, wow, this is threatening our actual economy in a big way, and they could get ahead of it. Or there's also the chance that, you know, when things are so profit focused, there's maybe a little bit less emphasis on orbital debris and, you know, stewardship of low Earth orbit. So I wonder if you have any just off the cuff thoughts on that.
Yeah, those are great questions. Absolutely. Actually, you know, I think that for one thing, I think commercial space companies absolutely do care about the state of the debris environment. And I think that we've actually seen, you know, from our vantage point at Astroscale, we've seen a lot of participation and a lot of vocal comments on, you know, where the lines should be in terms of how commercial actors should be mitigating, you know, their own debris creation and assessing the risk of their systems within the orbits that they're in. But you know, this is a much wider question in space policy internationally. For those countries that are only just now starting to get involved in space technologies, they're having their first official, you know, government satellites launched, et cetera. You know, how much of the burden does actually fall onto them for mitigating debris? And this has ties to other questions as well about, for example, you know, the use of space resources. You know, the legacy space countries are by far, you know, the biggest contributors to the space debris problem, and they're farthest along in terms of, you know, space resources and utilization of resources, you know, whether that's on the surface of the moon or a little further out, you know, the asteroid mining kind of conversations, and in space, you know, in space operations as well. You know, they're the furthest along, and so there's a bit of a question of, you know, who should be the people who are actually paying to clean up debris, and to who should play the largest role in spurring, you know, responsible activities in space. So I wish I had the answer to this question. I don't. You know, this is something that at Astroscale, you know, we are absolutely, you know, we think about it all the time, and we're constantly talking about it. You know, we think it's in everybody's best interest to be following the standards and practices, whether or not they're binding law or not, to, you know, to facilitate the use of space for as long as possible, for as many people as possible, so that way the most people can benefit from the services that space systems are providing to us on the ground, right? But that doesn't happen with the way that we're, you know, the way we're operating now. The status quo, I guess, the current practices in place, they're simply not going to be enough to stop, you know, the proliferation of the debris population to the point where it, you know, those orbits eventually become too crowded and too congested, too costly to operate in. So, you know, we don't think anybody should be contributing debris to space if they can help it. They should be doing everything they can to not do that. But for some of these newer space countries, these newer space nations, they're looking at the state of things and saying, you know, we haven't done any of this, so why is it on us? You know, so it's I would say that the forums like the UN COPUOS and UN USA, you know, led projects to form working groups around these issues. They have definitely had a time with that. It's an interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It'll be a hard and a long-term question, it sounds like, but I'm glad you and the good folks at Astroscale are continuing to ponder on that topic. So great. Well, next, I wanted to ask about another paper that you co-authored in March 2020. Sure. It was an Aerospace Corporation report about satellite light pollution. I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about light pollution from proliferated low Earth orbit constellations, what some people call mega constellations. And just, you know, in case we have somebody in the audience who hasn't heard about this, so just let us know what is satellite light pollution, who's upset about it, what are the possible damages resulting from it? Because I know just a couple of months ago, it was a brand new topic to me. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, no problem. So yeah, so just as kind of an intro, I guess, these the cost of actually launching a kilogram of mass to space has gone down a lot in the past 2 decades. It's since the turn of the century, essentially. And so because of that, we're seeing a miniaturization of space technologies. Satellites used to, for the most part, be huge, expensive, throw all your eggs in one basket, everything that you possibly want a satellite to do. You'll take the time and the money to put it on there and send it up and have it last for 10 to 15 years or so. And that was just the way that we did space. So obviously that has now really changed. We're seeing smaller satellites that are less reliable, and by reliable I mean they are made to be more cost effective, and therefore the risk that they pose of failure is higher risks of failure is accepted in those systems. And to compensate for that, they are launched to orbits that are relatively low, compared to a traditional GEO satellite. Within LEO, low Earth orbit, they are essentially expected to reach the end of their operational lifetime, sometimes within even 5 years or less. And there is a certain percentage of satellites in that system that are just sort of expected to fail. So the logic is essentially, instead of one big satellite and all of your capabilities on that, you instead distribute the capability across a range of satellites at a lower altitude, and then as part of that model, you are constantly refreshing the constellation with new iterations of further spacecraft down the line. So this is definitely a very cost-effective way of doing things, but it comes at a cost of now the orbital shells that those constellations are in. Sometimes it can take tens of thousands of satellites to deliver the same capability that smaller constellations way up in GEO would be able to do. So these shells are becoming a little bit more crowded, and as I'm sure most of the students within the institute probably are very familiar with, this creates a huge big data problem in terms of how you manage the potential conjunctions between all of those objects, the sort of all on all, what's the risk of collision between all of those systems. So for the purposes of mega constellations, another sort of unforeseen effect is that at certain altitudes and at certain times of night, usually just after sunset and just before sunrise, the satellites are very reflective. They have a high albedo, so they are causing streaks within the telescopes of optical telescopes trying to do their job, and astronomers have been very, very vocal about the impact to their science goals from these systems. So the report that I authored at the Aerospace Corporation, this was just after the first sort of batch of Starlinks had gone up. We were still wondering how much, how severe this problem was actually going to be, whether or not there would be sort of a quick fix for it. That report is a little bit out of date now, but essentially we were saying, we were looking at, what would the overall impact be of these reflections. So actually, just last week there was a panel on this issue at the Secure World Foundation's
Oh, yeah.
Summit for Space Sustainability. So I think they have the video of that up on their YouTube channel. I encourage folks to check it out if they're interested. But you know, we were essentially looking at the problem and saying, you know, how does this compare to, you know, the impacts to debris, which is actually more of a severe problem. And you know, I think in the long run, you know, we proposed a couple of different options for how, you know, any new standards for these commercial actors who are putting up these mega constellations could be decided upon, because you never want to have anything that's too prescriptive that can, you know, make it a burden on those companies and potentially impact their business case of actually doing these activities. But you know, you also want to make sure that the entire field of optical astronomy isn't in danger.
Annihilated.
Yeah. So you know, it's also pretty important. So it's a balance of interest, really, at its core. I think that for this particular light pollution issue, there have been, since the time of you know, publishing that report, there have been a couple of follow-on studies that are, you know, much more in depth by you know, AAAS and others who have gotten together and said, okay, you know, how can we make this work? For Starlink in particular, SpaceX I know has for the you know, following iterations of Starlinks, they have enacted a reflective, anti-reflective coating on some of their satellites that, you know, decrease that impact. But it's still very much an open issue. And it's just another one of those things where sometimes when you're doing, you know, these new space activities that haven't been done before on this scale, there are unforeseen issues that come up that you have to think about, and you have to deal with them kind of more in the moment. So for myself, it was really interesting to look at the policy angle, because astronomy, like space debris, is conducted all over the world, and there's a global angle to the stakeholders here. So that's what we've largely focused on in the paper was how bad is this problem? How does it compare to the debris problem? And you know, what might we see happen in the future? So yeah.
Great. Well, it's a great read, and it connects well to the next question I have for you, which is on, I mean, as you well know, you write about some very technical issues, and satellite constellations are inherently super technical. Like, I've read different reports that are talking about, oh, if we launch these satellites and we can't establish connection with them, maybe we can put mirrors on the corner and we can shoot a laser at it. That's my layman's policy term take on something I read that I didn't understand. I'd love to hear if you have any pointers for folks who are interested either specifically in space policy or broadly in science, technology policy. How do you ingest and analyze scientific information and translate it into meaningful policy recommendations? I mean, it's so much easier said than done. I feel like there's also a point when you have to just stop and say, I'm trusting these scientists who wrote this. So when they say that, I just repeat that, you know? But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on any advice you might have. And then if you have any thoughts on how the US specifically could improve the exchange between scientists and policymakers.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take the first question first. Sure. About ingesting technical information. So there are, I guess, kind of two things I want to say about this. The first is that, you know, science really benefits from the methods and you know, considerations provided by other humanities. I think we touched on this earlier, but it's very, very easy to become so hyper narrow focused in the specific, you know, projects that you're doing as a scientist, that you don't consider the wider implications of your work. and you don't really consider, like you mentioned before, some of the assumptions that go into that work. So for myself, when I'm reading something that is deeply technical, you know, I tend to review it for myself, and then also, you know, talk to somebody in that field. I think one of the best parts of my job is I can kind of act as a little bit of an intermediary between densely technical side folks and you know, folks that, you know, especially when you're talking about, you know, a piece of legislation, you know, their expertise is all in government affairs and politics, and they don't study this kind of thing at all. So it's, you know, it's something that we sometimes say is the role of a SciComm or you know, that kind of you know, expert. But it's really a shaping science and technology policy question more so than it is like informing the public. It is definitely, you know, important to inform the public, especially when you're trying to set agendas and priorities for, you know, what should be, you know, funded in terms of, you know, like science and technology directions of a specific nation. But for myself, like in the context of what I do, if there's something I don't understand, it's 100% more like productive to go, you know, if you can't find the author, you know, actually go and talk to those people who are conducting the science themselves and ask them to break it down. Now, not all scientists are good at that. And that's part of the skill set that I've tried to own myself, is the ability to kind of bring things down to a layman level and you know, make it a little bit more of a, okay, cause effect. You know, what are the different branches that, you know, this can take? What are the possible impacts it could have? Consider the stakeholders of who could be affected. And then from there, do a second thought. Okay, who did I not put in that list that could absolutely be affected by something like this? But you know, I think sometimes people think of policy for like science policy as kind of like a one-way street where, you know, you have science conducted, it's conducted in kind of a vacuum. It's conducted by mad scientists with no other, you know, biases or no other, you know, motivations other than just the pursuit of knowledge. And then whatever the results of that are, politicians and lawmakers say, okay, this is what the science is, and therefore we should do this. They think of it as kind of that one-way street, but the, you know, the reality of the way that even, you know, very critical studies with, you know, implications for, you know, things like, you know, directly affecting human lives, the way that that actually happens is that, you know, whatever institution those scientists are within, they don't do something unless they have the budget for it, unless it's specifically marked as a policy priority. So the process starts so much, you know, earlier than the actual, you know, formulation of, you know, proposals and research projects. You have to, as a government, prioritize what you want to invest in. So obviously, when it comes to space in particular, space is a field that has seen a lot of very broad bipartisan support. Space sustainability in general as well, I think, has seen some widespread bipartisan support because I think it, you know, it has such widespread benefits across the economic sector, the science sector, et cetera. There's a lot of great knowledge that we can get from space systems, some of which is impossible to get from any other vantage point other than the vantage point provided from space. So space, you know, space technologies offer that. And that has been, you know, I think a pretty foundational reason that it's seen a lot of, you know, bipartisan support. But, you know, if we're talking big picture here, like science doesn't just shape policy, policy absolutely shapes science. So considering, you know, the stakeholders of who is funding a study, for example, not just who the authors are, is, a step that I always recommend for people who are wanting to learn more about science policy. If you find something that interests you, or you see results of a study in a headline that seems to be a little crazy, how the hell did they come up with this? What does this mean? Looking to see, the direction of where that came from. And, if there was any specific policy goal that was, excuse me, that was intended to be answered by that study, that's a great place to start.
Yeah. Wow. I'd actually really never thought about that. Like there is certainly a sense in the field, and it has been a sense in me, all knowledge in science policy flows originally from science, and science is, always correct. And that's certainly not true. Policy, as you said, dictates science and what gets funded. But then in addition to that, scientists we're all biased, and that's just how the world works. So the more folks from different disciplines we have working on a single issue, the more likely it is there will be some checking of our psychological biases. So that's,
this is another kind of there's a whole field about this, examining the history of what's even been considered science and who's been excluded from that. There are a lot of different knowledges and archives and systems of thinking about the world, that have been completely dismissed from the academic canon of science, all because, the individuals that were, within those communities were not considered to be rigorous enough for, more obvious reasons like racism and sexism, right? Like, what is even considered to be science itself also is highly biased throughout history. So
yeah,
the bigger can of worms for sure.
It sure is. I would love to go on a whole other topic with you of traditional ecological knowledge and all of that. But in addition to the fact that I've robbed you 15 minutes of your time, it seems you're choking on water too. So it's, I'm so sorry. It's a great topic. We got all worked up. I unfortunately do have to wrap it up there. Luc, thank you so much for your time. I feel awful this is happening right now. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it. I have like 4 or 5 more questions left on my list. So we might pester you another time in the future for a resumed episode of the expert.
I would love that.
Great. And on behalf of, all of our students and the folks watching this, thank you for the great advice and the great input. It was really just lovely.
Hey, thank you so much. Yeah, I got so choked up talking about the history of science. Yeah, no, sorry about that. I really appreciate the invitation, and always happy to come back and talk. So.
Great. All right, we'll have to make it happen. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.